Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of St. Mary's Hospital's main lobby, bathing the corridors in a white, almost clinical light. Nurses and doctors hurried about, each absorbed in their duties. Among them, Tiana Johnson, a young black nurse of 28, moved with calm but purpose. She wore her immaculate uniform and carefully held a patient chart, walking with the precision and discipline her job demanded. Tiana loved her job. She loved helping people, easing their fears, and looking after their well-being. But for the past few months, she had to endure the incessant remarks of Dr. Jonathan Blake, a renowned doctor known for his arrogance and lack of tact. Her colleagues whispered that Blake enjoyed humiliating those he deemed inferior in front of patients, and Tiana had already been a victim of this several times. That morning, Blake was particularly grumpy. A failed morning meeting and a bad night's sleep seemed to have exacerbated his temper. He was hunched over a file, frowning, when he saw Tiana approaching with her patient's file. "Tiana," he said sharply, without looking up, "make sure this file is correct. Last time, you almost caused chaos in my department." Tiana felt her cheeks warming, but she remained calm. "I always double-check, Dr. Blake. You can trust me." Blake finally looked up, glaring at her. He smiled cruelly. "Trust me," he repeated. "You know, some people think being a nurse just means wearing a uniform. But you seem to think that's enough to avoid making mistakes." At that precise moment, the patient, a man lying on the examination table, listened silently to the scene. William Carter, a wealthy businessman in the city, had just undergone delicate surgery. His head rested on the pillow, but his dark eyes observed every movement, every word. He had seen plenty of arrogant behavior in his life, but he knew how to recognize arrogance and racism when he encountered them. Blake, unaware of the patient's identity, continued to humiliate Tiana in front of him. "Seriously, Tiana, I don't understand how someone can be so." He stopped when he saw Mr. Carter's penetrating gaze. Silence fell in the room. Tiana sensed a strange tension in the air, but she maintained her professionalism, trying not to show her anger or shame. Dr. Blake, however, was beginning to sense that something was wrong. What Blake didn't know was that his words and actions were setting in motion a chain of events that would change his career and his life. The man he was humiliating, and Tiana, wasn't just any patient, he was the most influential man in the city, and he wasn't about to let such an affront go unpunished. In that moment, power seemed to silently shift sides. Dr. Blake didn't know it yet, but his arrogance would soon have its consequences. Tiana Johnson felt her heart race as Dr. Blake continued his criticism. Every word seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. She knew her colleagues were watching, some with embarrassment, others with compassion, but she had to remain professional. She took a deep breath, clutching the file to her chest like an invisible shield. "Tiana, honestly," Blake began, his voice icy, "how can you think you can work here if you can't even distinguish a simple medical file?" Tiana raised her eyes, maintaining her apparent calm. "Dr. Blake, I always make sure everything is correct before bringing it to you." But Blake didn't want to hear it. He leaned slightly towards her, a cruel smile stretching his lips. "That's not enough. Some people should consider another career if incompetence is their only talent." Tiana felt anger rising within her, but she kept it in check. She remembered all the times she had endured similar humiliations and knew that impulsively retaliating would only make things worse. However, that day, something in the air felt different. William Carter, the patient, watched silently. His dark eyes followed Dr. Blake's every move. He had seen arrogant doctors and deplorable behavior before, but the way Blake humiliated a young black nurse in front of a patient filled him with inner revolt. Carter decided to remain silent for a moment, allowing Blake to sink further into his condescension, so he could fully assess his character. "And you," Blake continued, ignoring the patient, "you seem to think you can impress anyone here with your mere presence." Carter inhaled slowly, his hand resting on the bed, his muscles tense. He knew he had to intervene, but he wanted to do so with maximum efficiency, so that every word would count. Tiana, for her part, gritted her teeth. She could feel Blake's gaze upon her, as well as those of her other colleagues, some sympathetic, others incredulous. She remembered why she loved her job. It wasn't for the compliments, but to help people and do what was right. And she knew that, despite the humiliation, she had to maintain her dignity. It was then that Carter, in a firm but calm voice, spoke for the first time. "Dr. Blake. I believe you should be more respectful to the staff." Blake, surprised, looked up. He finally saw the patient and his arrogance began to waver. He immediately recognized William Carter and felt a shiver of concern run down his spine. The silence that followed was heavy. Tiana felt a strange satisfaction, not for Blake, but because someone powerful had just stood up for her, even if silently. For the first time in a long time, she felt supported. Carter continued, still in a controlled voice. "Your comments have no place here, especially in front of me. I expect everyone here, regardless of their position, to be treated with respect and dignity." Dr. Blake, red with shame and anger, stammered a few words, but none seemed appropriate. He suddenly realized that he had just put himself in a difficult situation, humiliated in front of a patient whose influence could destroy his career. The chapter ends on this palpable tension, Tiana, silent but dignified, and Blake, shocked and vulnerable, while William Carter observes every detail, ready to ensure that justice is done. Silence fell over the room. The machines hummed softly, punctuating the heavy atmosphere. Dr. Blake, red with anger and embarrassment, tried to find the right words, but his usual arrogance was beginning to waver. He realized he had underestimated the situation. William Carter, the patient, spoke again, his voice firm and calm, each word measured. "Dr. Blake, you just humiliated Tiana Johnson in front of me. Do you know who I am?" Blake stiffened. He frowned, his mind racing. William Carter," he stammered. "You are, the—" Carter nodded slowly, a slight, cold smile on his lips. "Exactly. And I don't think you're aware of the consequences of your actions." Tiana, motionless, felt a thrill of satisfaction. Finally, the situation was taking a turn that vindicated her experience. But she remained cautious, aware that Blake could still react unpredictably. Blake stammered, trying to justify himself. I didn't know. Carter interrupted him, his tone icy but controlled. "You didn't know? Let me remind you that in a hospital, respect and professionalism must prevail, regardless of the identity of those you are humiliating. And it just so happens that I am more than a patient here." Blake's gaze flickered, a cold sweat beading on his temple. He realized that what he had taken for a simple nurse's humiliation had just turned into a potential personal disaster. Carter, an influential man in the city, had the power to ruin a doctor's reputation in minutes. The patient turned slightly towards Tiana, in a discreet but protective gesture. "Stay calm, Tiana. Don't let this guy get to you. You did your job competently and with dignity." Blake, visibly shaken, tried to gather his words. But Carter continued without giving him any room. "Your apologies, Dr. Blake, are not enough. Your actions will be reviewed by management. And rest assured that I will not tolerate this kind of racist and humiliating behavior, whether towards staff or patients." For the first time, Blake felt the full extent of his mistakes. Silence fell again, but this time it was a silence heavy with consequences. Tiana, though still nervous, felt a new strength surge through her. She was no longer alone in facing the humiliation. The chapter ends with Blake, shaken and humiliated, while Carter and Tiana exchange a silent glance. The dynamic had just shifted dramatically. The one who was supposed to be at the top of his game, Dr. Blake, was now vulnerable, under the gaze of a man capable of derailing his career. Dr. Blake remained frozen, his eyes desperately searching for a way out. Pride and fear mingled within him as he realized he was no longer in control. The room seemed smaller, more oppressive. Every movement by William Carter reinforced the feeling that Blake was now vulnerable. Carter sat up slightly in bed, his dark gaze fixed on the doctor. "Dr. Blake, do you think your position gives you the right to humiliate someone?" Blake opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. He felt the weight of the stares around him. The medical staff, witnesses to the scene, exchanged worried or surprised glances. Some whispered to each other, "He's going to get a serious dressing down." Tiana, still standing, felt her heart clench. She had endured humiliation and injustice for a long time, but now the situation seemed to be turning in her favor. She took a deep breath and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "I'm simply doing my job, Dr. Blake. Your words and your attitude don't change that." Carter nodded slightly, as if to reinforce the silent support he was offering Tiana. Then, his voice rose, clear and authoritative. "I am not just a patient here. I am someone whose influence can affect your career and the reputation of this hospital. Your racist and humiliating comments are unacceptable, and I intend to ensure they are dealt with by the appropriate authorities." Blake, pale and trembling, tried to defend himself clumsily. But I didn't want to, it wasn't." Carter shook his head disdainfully. "Intentions are not enough, Dr. Blake. The consequences of your actions are real, and you will have to face them." Silence fell once more, this time heavy with a dramatic tension that Blake could no longer ignore. Tiana's nurses and colleagues, shocked but relieved for her, began to murmur quiet words of encouragement. The atmosphere shifted. Blake was no longer the center of authority. He was vulnerable, exposed to those he had tried to belittle. Tiana felt a mixture of relief and inner strength. For the first time, she was no longer the silent victim. She had witnessed the confrontation, but she hadn't been alone. And as Blake looked at Carter, his expression hardened into a bitter realization: he had underestimated the power of his actions and the power of the people he considered insignificant. The chapter ends on a striking image: Blake, humiliated and vulnerable, unable to defend himself, while Carter and Tiana exchange a silent glance, both aware that the real power now came from their side. The next morning, Dr. Blake received a call from the hospital administration. His once steady voice trembled slightly when he answered. He was informed that an emergency meeting of the board of directors had been called to review his conduct. William Carter's words and the testimonies of Tiana's colleagues had triggered a formal investigation. Blake felt his world crumble. He had always believed that his status and influence protected him, but he was discovering, too late, that arrogance and racism came at a price. Meanwhile, Tiana entered the treatment room, greeted by a discreet smile from Carter. "You showed a lot of courage yesterday, Tiana. Thank you for remaining calm." Tiana felt a mixture of emotion and pride. For the first time in a long time, she was fully supported, not only by an influential patient, but also by her colleagues. The board of directors met. The evidence and testimonies were presented, and Blake was confronted with the reality of his actions. He received a temporary suspension and was required to attend training on cultural sensitivity and respect in the workplace. His reputation was severely damaged, and he understood that his career would never be the same again. Tiana, for her part, received praise for her professionalism and dignity. Her colleagues looked at her with newfound respect, and some even dared to offer her admiring smiles. Her courage had inspired the entire team and reinforced the message that respect and competence prevail over arrogance and racism. William Carter, still lying on his bed, cast a final glance at Blake. "I hope you learn this lesson, Dr. Blake. Humiliating others never elevates you." Blake lowered his eyes, ashamed and aware of his mistakes. He had learned the hard way that power does not reside solely in status or title, but in respect, dignity, and integrity. The chapter ends with Tiana, smiling but humble, returning to her duties with a sense of restored justice. The lesson was clear: sometimes, quiet courage, combined with the justice and vigilance of others, could transform fear into strength and humiliation into redemption.